we're in this wonderful study group together with a bunch of scholars and writers and activists. You convened us, in fact, you and Kelly Brown Douglas. And some of what we're talking about in that group is faith and politics and the place where they intersect, collide, clash, crash. If you are giving us a state of the union today, what's happening? What's going on?
Wow. Well, that's like a big one to swing at right off the bat. Anyway, well, thanks for having me though tonight. I'm always happy to be in conversation with you and partnering in all the important work you're doing, and looking forward to being in New York with you in just a few weeks now. It's coming up very fast. You know, it's some of the work we've been doing recently has centered around this question and this issue of white Christian nationalism, right? I think there's been a lot of ink spilled about that, and we wanted to try to really answer the question of like, well, okay, well, how big a problem is it? What is it? And you know, how do we get a handle on how many Americans are sympathetic to it? What kind of a threat is it? So we, in partnership with the Brookings Institution, a month ago, put together the largest public opinion survey of its kind, trying to measure these attitudes. And so, you know, at the beginning of it, we tried to measure this idea of Christian nationalism. And I should just say, before we get into the nitty gritty here, that, you know, this is really a new term for a very old problem, right? And that we've had in the US. And so, and you know, so we talk about it as white Christian nationalism, but it really is underneath all of it. It boils down to just this idea that this country, that America, was intended to be this kind of promised land for European Christians, right? And that's who owned this land, this space. So it explains, you know, the colonial attitude and the attitude that really justified the genocide and displacement of Native Americans in this country, as well as the enslavement of Africans here, and this idea that it was really justified by God, right, behind it. So it's a survival into our present time of this very old idea. So just to give you a couple of ideas behind it, when we measured it, we tried to get at it by asking a number of questions, and I'll just give you a couple to give you the flavor of it. So, for example, do you agree, or these are agree, disagree questions, that the U.S. government should declare the country a Christian nation, that U.S. laws should be based on Christian values, that God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society? So that's a series of questions, and kind of came together with 5 questions like that, and we built a scale out of those 5 questions, and then scored people on this scale and came up with kind of 4 categories of folks, depending on how intensely they agreed with those statements. And so the 4 categories are, we call Christian nationalism adherents. They were people who just overwhelmingly agreed with all of those statements and very strongly agreed. Right beneath that group is Christian nationalism sympathizers, people who agreed but maybe less strongly, but are still sympathetic to those views. And then on the other side are 2 other categories we call Christian nationalism skeptics and rejectors. The rejectors are those who completely disagree with all of those sentiments. And, you know, what we found is kind of I think you can read this a couple of ways. Like, on the one hand, I think the good news is that by a margin of 2 to 1, Americans overall reject those ideas, right? That the country is essentially a white Christian country. And it's only about 3 in 10 Americans who are either Christian nationalism adherents. About 10% of the country are full-on adherents, but about another 19% are sympathetic to that view. But here's where it gets, I think, you asked me kind of the state of the union. I think where it gets into power and politics and danger zones for our democracy is that these views, even though they're rejected by Americans overall by 2 to 1, have made significant inroads into 2 major groups. One of them is a religious group, white evangelical Protestants, where 2/3 of that group are sympathetic to this worldview, and Republicans, and 54% of Republicans. So a solid majority of Republicans have also become kind of sympathetic to this worldview. So even though it's 2 to 1 Americans rejecting it, because it's gotten really ensconced on one side of the partisan divide in the country, it is wreaking a lot more havoc than you might think if you just saw the numbers alone.
Robbie, it is startling news. And I'm curious about the overlap, the Venn diagram kind of overlap about, let's say, evangelical Christians and the Republicans, right?
Yeah.
How much of that is the same group? I'm trying to make with my hand.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of overlap there, and that is what's driving those Republican attitudes,
Yeah.
really, at the end of the day. So, it's interesting that, so white evangelicals, you wouldn't know this from kind of watching the news and how much power they exerted during the Trump administration in particular, but they've been declining quite significantly over the last 20 years. So, you go back 20 years ago, they were nearly a quarter of the US population. And our latest numbers at PRI have them, they're only 13.6% of the country today. Let me say they get 13.6% of the country, but they make up more than a third of Republicans, right? So they're just so heavily represented in this one side of our partisan divide, and they voted, 85% for Trump. And so they've just so declared themselves on one side of the partisan divide that they wield this kind of, a disproportionate influence and power because of that.
Bobby, so last week was Crazy Town with Trump getting arrested, indicted, arraigned, whatever the right word is. Yeah. But, and the kind of comparison of him as Messiah during Holy Week with Jesus as Messiah. What would your polling tell us about that kind of theological construct?
Well, I guess the first thing to say is that, we have had any number of what we might have thought of as bright lines that Trump has crossed, right? You might think, oh, okay, well, if he does this, right, then surely all the supporters are going to, especially his Christian supporters, are going to abandon him, right? But that goes way back to the beginning of all of this, right? With these accusations, in this alleged affair early in his marriage, and then right after that Access Hollywood tape, all that was before he was ever elected, right? And then we've got any number of things, ending with a violent insurrection to try to overthrow a free and fair election, and ending, the peaceful transition of power in the U.S., right? That we've never had that happen in U.S. history, and yet what we find in the polling is that his support among his most stalwart conservative white Christians, white evangelicals, has really flagged very little. We're still looking at his support is, well above 60%, mid 60s among white evangelicals. And so, this idea that he had, he could, I think the phrase, I could walk down Fifth Avenue with a gun and shoot somebody in, broad daylight in New York, and nobody would, none of my followers would abandon me. There's some truth to that among his most stalwart supporters. And I think that this idea of, Trump as Messiah is not far off the mark for the way he's seen. I mean, you can see this as some of his fan art that kind of travels around social media, where he's superimposed on images that would be Jesus in other contexts, those kinds of things, images with Jesus with his hand on his head, all of these kind of, blasphemous, things really. But I think the idea is this, that so the question is okay, if he's the Messiah, what is he saving them from? Right. Yeah. And what is it that they feel like they need saving from? And I think the answer to that, it goes back to this basic idea that he is saving them from a diversifying country, right? One that is no longer majority white and Christian, and one that they feel like they are entitled to. And I think that's been the real power of Trump all along. It hasn't really been abortion or any particular issue. It has really been this idea, and Trump would just say this straight out to people, right? When he was talking to evangelical audience, he would say, look, if you don't elect me, you're not going to have a country anymore. I don't know how many times he said that phrase and what he means, right? If you unpack that, what kind of country is he thinking is no longer here? It's that kind of 1950s, America, where white Christians kind of held sway and power and kind of all realms of society. And that's really what I think has led to him having this, following that just seems to not care what he actually does, as long as he's continuing to bring back that vision of the country.
Robbie, I want to take you back to one of your earliest comments here, and which is really kind of back to the past, which is the future, right? This thing, this phenomenon, this kind of faith that's based on manifest destiny, papal bull, go over there and convert the heathens and take the land and do the things and make it Christian. A kind of chosenness narrative, right? A kind of chosenness narrative where white evangelical Christians, and before them, just white Christians, white, even not necessarily maybe not even theists, but white land-owning, powerful people use that sense of chosenness narrative to say, this is ours to take, to do, to be, to make, to claim. Do you think, Robbie, that this time is more dramatic, more intense, more dangerous than those other times in our history?
Yeah, well, I think what's different and what our generation has had to face that no other, and I'm speaking now of white Christians, what this generation of white Christians have not had to face, are facing that no other generation has had to face, is the actual shift in the country from being majority white and Christian to no longer being majority white and Christian, right? So as recently as 2008, when Barack Obama was first running for president, the country was 54% white and Christian, right? Today, that number's 42, right? So just during, and that transition, actually, we passed that kind of marker in the country's history during our first African-American president's tenure as president, right? So I think this symbolic presence of an African-American man in the White House, while we're undergoing this sea change, and the symbolic shift from going from majority to not majority white and Christian, has set off this kind of visceral reaction. I think that's why it seems so angry, so ugly, because there isn't in previous generations, white Christians could kind of give a wink and a nod to religious pluralism and to racial pluralism, even knowing that they kind of had a lock on political and cultural power just by sheer numbers, right? That's no longer true, right? So now the proof is in the pudding. Like, do we really mean it? When we say we're supporting democracy, do we really mean it when we say we're supporting religious pluralism when we're no longer the unquestioned majority? And I think that's why this has become just so challenging for so many and so dangerous for us.
And the fight on many fronts, right? I was talking to Linda Sarsour right before we got on the line, just kind of talking about what's even going on. So what's going on in Judaism, what's going on in Islam, not just white evangelical Christianity, but a rising up of right-leaning sentiments and resistance to the cultural shifts that are happening, and even the buying in. We've seen in Israel and here in America, certain sects of Judaism, there's a way in which I'm going to say white evangelical, white nationalist language has a lot of power of imagination across faiths. Is thinking is true? What do you think?
Yeah, I think one commonality here is that many of these worldviews, have in mind a kind of a fixed worldview, right? That has hierarchies and clear categories that are black and white, right? You're male or you're female, you're black or you're white, and depending on which category you're in, you're higher or lower on the pyramid, right? And you are higher and lower on the pyramid by God's design, right? That's the way God designed a kind of hierarchical, ordered world. And if you're a white straight man, you're up here at the top, right? And everybody else finds their place in the pecking order down the way. But I think the reason why that we see so many attacks on LGBTQ people and trans people particularly is because they are upsetting that sense of fixed order, right? And hierarchy. And so people that don't fit in one category or another and threaten the very idea of fixed gender, those kinds of things. And because if you can't fix those categories, you can't put them in a hierarchy, right? And so the whole world breaks down in a way. And I think that's really part of what's links some of these things together is this kind of, it really is kind of a colonial era mindset. It's hundreds of years old. And I think in this country, it really comes down to, and I've got this new book coming out in the fall where I'm kind of holding these two things together, and that one of the things in the American context is that we've never really decided whether we truly believe in a pluralistic democracy, or whether we believe in this idea of chosenness and it's a white Christian country. And we've allowed that view to kind of grow up alongside a kind of lip service to pluralistic democracy. And we're really being put to the test now about which of those visions of the country we really believe.
Which America do we want to be? And Robbie, I want to get to your new book, but seriously, I think were it not for movements, were it not for the crushing weight of white supremacist ideologies, crippling the poor, disenfranchising the vote, making women feel like second-class citizens, anti-gay, all the things, all the pendulum that was way to the right, that the movements, gay movement, Black women movement, voters' rights movements, pulled the pendulum, pulled the moral arc of the universe, let's say, more toward justice. Would we have ever been a pluralistic democracy? Like, wasn't the system doing what it meant to do, right? It was doing what it meant to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, clearly, you mentioned, these papal documents. I mean, it's notable that it got lost in all the news cycle because of all the craziness with Trump last week. But we had a moment where Pope Francis issued a statement from the Vatican, finally apologizing for and repudiating the doctrine of discovery, which was this set of papal bulls from the 15th century that really did justify the domination, subjugation of any non-Christian indigenous people anywhere in the world that weren't already dominated by another Christian kingdom, right? That's the way the document read. And it's literally, from the hand of the Pope, right? And this is before the Protestant split. So it's all of Western Christendom that's wrapped up in this, these documents. And there's finally an acknowledgement and a sort of repudiation, I will say, without quite taking full responsibility for it all. But still, at least the first time that there's been really a full acknowledgement from the Vatican. And I mean, I think you cannot read hardly any of the founding documents without tripping up on the doctrine of discovery. It's in the Declaration of Independence. It's in the Constitution. We think about, I mean, there are great principles there, right? But Declaration of Independence also talks about the indigenous people here as merciless savages, right? That's in the Declaration of Independence.
Exactly.
Right. The Constitution, right, doesn't guarantee it literally does mean men, right, in the Constitution, right? Women, people who are not white, all of that not counted, or only counted for the 3/5 in order to enhance white men's power, right? Yeah, right. So yes, we've been struggling with this, and it has been this generations, centuries long struggle to kind of hold on to those better principles that are so entangled, even in the documents, right, with this other worldview. And without those movements, without those voices, without those, martyrs, right? I mean, we would really not be anywhere near kind of disentangling the things that we're still, our generation has still got our own work to do.
Yeah, Robbie. I mean, I think, one of the things that I try to talk about a little bit in my book, Fierce Love, is this kind of history. I hope this next book I write has got a little more teeth on that. But like, there's a way in which the reason that folks are so happy to pretend that critical race theory is something for kids and it should be banned, the knowing of the truth that will set us free, the knowing of the embedded biases, racism, white supremacist ideologies in our founding documents, in our system, in the fabric of our systems, Robbie, that honestly, we need so many more of us jumping on that arc, is what I'm trying to say, to bend that moral arc of the universe toward justice, and not necessarily to be so satisfied that there's something in place that's going to save us. I think what's going to save us is us, which makes me want to get to your book. Let's talk about the new work you're doing. It's
Sure.
coming
Yeah.
out. Oh,
It's coming out September 5th, right after Labor Day. Yeah. So, I didn't really intend to write anything as sophisticated as what you might call a trilogy, but as I was finishing this book, I did realize it's kind of the third book I've done with Simon and Schuster, The End of White Christian America, then White Too Long, and then this one, which I've ended up calling The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and a Path to a Shared American Future, where I'm trying to look around the corner a bit while still, really mining this entanglement of, Christianity, politics, and white supremacy. And I actually spent a fair amount of time in this book talking about the doctrine of discovery and that early entanglement it predates the Republic, right? I mean, it really is way back to the dawn of the colonial era. And so I go back to 1493. That's where I kick off the book. But I'm also trying to link that story so that when we have the conversations around Emmett Till, we're also talking about Hernando de Soto, right, in Mississippi. And when we talk about the Tulsa Race Massacre in Oklahoma, we're also talking about the Trail of Tears, right? Yeah. And when we talk about, and so the three places I focus on are Mississippi, the Delta in Mississippi, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Duluth, Minnesota. So in Duluth, is lesser known, but there was a lynching of 3 African-American men there. And 10,000 people in a town that was, 98% white, and mostly Lutheran and Catholic, turn out for this lynching. It was a tenth of the town in 1920. But when we talk about that and the reckoning with that we also talk about the largest mass execution in American history actually occurred in Mankato, where 38 Dakota men were hung in mass, and that was authorized by Abraham Lincoln.
President, aren't I the Emancipator Lincoln?
Yeah, and he had those documents. He had the Emancipation Proclamation and the certification of this mass execution on his desk at the same time. These were simultaneous events, in history. So I think one thing I'm trying to do in this book is trying to hold together, the energy around Black Lives Matter and that reckoning that is happening, but trying to kind of hold that together and telling these other stories that kind of, because what happens is that if we can tell the story of kind of injustices and genocide of Native American people and the systematic enslavement and oppression of African Americans, what it does is it turns the gaze back around to, okay, well, those are the victims. Who are the perpetrators, right? And it was the same people, right? And it was all baptized in Christian theology and justified all the way through. So I'm really trying to kind of make those links in the new book.
I'm so glad that you're doing that. I can't wait to read it. It is really true that the two original American sins, let's say, right? And Robbie, because I think I've shared before that the church I pastor, like the oldest Protestant church in North America, Dutch Reformed Church, right, are the ones who stole the land from the Lenape and also are the ones who held slaves to help build New York. So that kind of holy, I'm going to call it holy, blessed, but unholy cocktail of church and state that led to the erasure of the indigenous folks and the enslavement of the Black folks is such an important conversation to have. Where do we go from here? We're gonna be talking about this together in New York in a couple of weeks at this Freedom Rising conference. But Robbie, what's a couple of things that folks can do who look like you to sort of learn, teach, move, groove? What can they do?
Yeah, well, I'm gonna not. This is not tongue in cheek. I mean, I really do think that, we could read books like yours. I think one thing that set me on this journey is reading people like Kelly Brown Douglas, James Cone, Emily Towns, African-American authors, theologians, writers, because there's a vision of Christianity. We're reading our family right now is reading Jesus and the Disinherited with our 13-year-old
That's the
son.
best book. That's great.
Howard Thurman's book. But I think that gives you a vision of Christianity that you don't get right at white church most of the time, and I think that's helpful. But I think the other pieces of this are just taking responsibility, like where we are. I think the most powerful things is starting with local stories, like you said. So what's the story of your church, right? Where it is located right now. And so, one simple thing, I think if every predominantly white Christian church would just ask the question, how did our building get to be on the land that it's on? And take that question all the way back. Right, it would very quickly get to all these questions we've been talking about. And then if you take that conversation seriously, it gets to a whole set of serious questions about contemporary responsibility, given that history.
I love that contemporary responsibility. We've been talking about reparations, and we'll be talking about that at the conference. But what does it mean to take responsibility? What does it mean to make amends? What does it mean to make repair? What does it mean to repent of the kind of churchdom, Christendom that we are inhabiting that is still built so much on broken theology that assumes we have a God who picked some of us over others of us to flourish and thrive? Robbie, say the name of your book again.
Thank you. It is The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and the Path to a Shared American Future.
The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy and a Path Forward. Yes. Robert P. Jones is going to put in the chat his how to follow him links. In case you don't know him, I'll bet you do. We're going to share this in the interwebs, Robbie, so that people can find you and your work. I am so grateful, Middle Family, who's here. I met Robbie a long time ago, and he did a study for us of young adults and what they wanted from church. And that was the beginning of our new congregation that has continued to grow from us trying to walk some walk in the way the young people expect. Robbie, I'm glad you came tonight. Thank you so much. Peace to you.
Thank you. And looking forward to seeing you in a few weeks.